He's got a very unique and interesting perspective on all of this as well. So, Troy.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. So the topic of the talk is I manage my type 1 diabetes eating low carb, high fat, and so I intend to take you essentially through my personal story, but also a little bit of the science which has been touched upon this morning. So firstly, just declaring any conflicts of interest. I have no conflicts of interest at all in this. This is just my story. Don't make any money out of it and don't plan to. So what is type 1 diabetes? There's often a bit of confusion about the difference between the different types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. That means that for some reason the body has taken it upon itself to attack part of itself. And in type 1 diabetes, it's the islet cells within the pancreas that are attacked by the immune system. And it destroys the islet cells, essentially. And because the role of the islet cells is to release insulin, and the role of insulin is to regulate the blood glucose levels. So without that insulin, the blood glucose levels rise, and that can cause problems. And without insulin replacement, it's a fatal condition. And so until prior to the discovery of insulin in the 1920s, which is probably one of modern medicine's greatest successes, children would die from this condition. It was uniformly fatal. And it can occur at any age, but it's most frequent in childhood. A lot of people think that because of the discovery of insulin that we've sort of solved the problem of diabetes, but there are lots of long-term complications of diabetes. So we were able to save these children from dying in childhood, but what happened was that initially, at least in the before we had sort of better control of blood glucose and could measure the levels, that usually they would live till about their 40s, and then the long-term complications of diabetes would kill them, essentially. And so there are lots of complications of diabetes. This is all forms of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. You've got nerve damage, vision damage, kidney damage, heart attacks, stroke, peripheral vascular disease, serious infections, increased rates of dementia, and also increased cancer risk. So I knew about all these, of course. I'm a doctor, and in my work I'm a radiologist. So I look at imaging, CAT scans, MRIs, those sorts of things, and I see all of these complications. So I was very aware of all of these complications. And so I thought I'd tell my story. And so I was 41 years old. I was married with 3 young boys, and was the director of the radiology department on the Sunshine Coast. I, was in the healthy weight range, but like, those other people, I sort of, I used to exercise quite a lot, but, did have trouble sort of shifting the weight and had tried to and really hadn't had, much success. But I was in the healthy weight range, reasonably fit and active, enjoyed sort of cycling, surfing, bushwalking. So here's a photo of me with my 3 boys, and that's my eldest boy there when he was learning to surf. This is a photo of I've got a couple of mates from uni, and every year we'd get together and do the Noosa Triathlon, just as a sort of a way of, getting together. We've all got busy lives and families, and it was sort of a thing we'd started to do where just as a team I'd do the cycling leg, and Paul on the left there would do, your left would do the swim, and Andrew would do the run. So, and I'll bring that in later on. You'll understand why that's in the talk. Then from August 2012, my weight started to rapidly fall off. I was trying to lose weight, so I thought, this is pretty cool, And just became a bit more tired and irritable, was suddenly sort of thirsty all the time, and started waking at night. And these are the classic symptoms of diabetes. You can actually see, I actually had a Wi-Fi scales there. You can see what happened to my weight. So that point where it just drops dramatically is August, and then that 68.7 was the 2nd of October. So this is a photo of me later that year. You can see how much weight I've dropped, and it was just stripping off me. A kilo a week I was dropping. On October 3rd, I'd woken up a couple of times overnight to pass urine. I thought, I looked at myself in the mirror and I was just losing so much weight, and I'd actually started, my eyes had become sunken. I thought, that's the brown fat. You've got 2 different types of fat. And I thought, wow, this is really odd. Couldn't be diabetes, could it? It's just like no. Anyway, I actually had some dipsticks in the cupboard because I'd had a bit of a fright with one of my little boys. I thought he might have had it, and I put some dipsticks anyway. I thought, I'll dipstick my urine, it'll be a microsecond of my life and it'll all be over, and go on and do the things I do anyway. 4+ glucose and ketones. So I was, wow, that's amazing. You know, I knew basically that I diagnosed myself with diabetes. I went to work that day and got the blood glucose meter out, and it tested high, which means blood glucose over 26. Normal range is 3 to 6, and 4 to 8 probably, some people would say. And so went and saw the endocrinologist. He did my HbA1c, which is a measure of your blood glucose levels for the preceding 120 days, or the lifespan of your red blood cells. Normal range is less than 5.5, mine was 11.9. So that confirmed a diagnosis of diabetes. They tested my some antibodies, and that showed they were high. You can see the antibodies there, 1950 for the GAD-AB, and the IA2 is in the thousands. And that means that I had an autoimmune attack against my pancreas, and therefore it's type 1 diabetes and not type 2 diabetes. So I had the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes confirmed. And I was shattered. I can't sort of begin to tell you how shattered I was. As I said, I know all the complications of diabetes, I know what it means, and I was completely devastated by this diagnosis. So anyway, go off, to the clinic, of course, and I get exactly that. I don't criticise the clinic. I got the standard dietary advice that you would get at any diabetes clinic, any of the best centres around the world, and they told me that I was to eat, 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrate at each meal 3 times a day, and then I would, snack a couple of times a day, 15 to 30 grams of carbohydrate. That adds up to a total of 240 grams of carbohydrate a day, and it was based on the food pyramid. You can see all the sort of grains and things down the bottom I'm supposed to eat, all the fruit, which is full of sugar, that I'm supposed to eat, and that was the advice I was given. So, if you go to the diabetes website, this is taken directly from Diabetes Australia website. This is what they say. Help manage your diabetes, need to be regular, lower in fat, particularly saturated fat, and based on high fibre carbohydrate foods such as whole grain breads and cereals, beans, lentils, vegetables and fruit. So, I know all about the complications. I'm devastated by this diagnosis. You hear a lot about all these sort of poorly compliant diabetics and all this sort of stuff. So, I'm going to be the best patient. I don't want those complications. I've got a young family. So, and there's been some big studies that have shown that if you can get your glucose levels under control, that you can reduce your insulin requirements, your long-term complications. And so this is probably the biggest trial that's been done, and a very, very important trial. And what they showed was that if you could manage your blood sugars, that you could reduce your risk of vascular disease by 42%, that's heart attack, stroke by 57%, and you could also reduce your microvascular complications. Now, the thing about this trial was that both arms of the trial, so there's 2 different groups, one group with intensive control, so 4 injections of insulin a day on a diet of 240 grams of carbohydrate, and the other group with less sort of intensive control, but also high carbohydrate. So they basically just assumed that, you're going to be on a high carbohydrate diet. But the problem with the intensive control was that there was a 3-fold increase in severe hypoglycemic reactions. So if blood sugars go low, then you can lose consciousness and fit, essentially. And so on the intensive arm, whilst they were able to reduce the long-term complications, they did have this problem, which was increased episodes of hypoglycemia. And they had excessive weight gain in the intensive group. And the other thing that they didn't have a low carbohydrate arm. So they had a high carbohydrate intensive therapy arm, a high carbohydrate less intensive therapy arm, but they did not have a low carbohydrate diet. Now, and further sort of to my reading, to try to avoid these complications, these would sort of be your aims. Now, these are far more strict than they normally recommend, and that's because of the risk of hypoglycemia. But if I wanted to sort of completely avoid these complications, which I feared so much, then really I would ideally want to have a HbA1c in the 5% range. Ideally, my fasting glucose would be less than 5.5 millimoles, and my after eating or postprandial glucose would be less than 7.8. And the normal ranges you see I've included there, so less than 5%, fasting of 4.8, postprandial less than 6.6. But the problem is, so what the sort of, essentially you're sort of given this formula, well, eat this much carbohydrate and then balance it with this much glucose. So that's sort of what you're trying. But the problem with this is there's lots and lots of variables. So there's a 50% error rate in the packet about how much carbohydrate there is. Your absorption rate of insulin varies by 30%. And then you've got other things like your rate of gastric emptying, exercise, stress, illness. All these factors will change, and so it's not as easy a mathematical equation as it's made out to be. You're sort of given this, 15 grams of carbohydrate, 1 unit of insulin, and you sort of match it, and we'll see how the experiment goes. So, I really felt that I was between the devil and the deep blue sea here. Like on the one hand, if I'm really, really intensive with my control, I'm going to have all these potentially hypoglycemic attacks, which I don't want. But then if I'm not intensive with my control, I get the long-term complications of diabetes. So how did I go? Well, this is November 2012, so this is a month after diagnosis now. And you can see there 5 is sort of where you want to be. The 2 dotted lines between is where you'd want to be. Insulin dose at the time was 24 units. Daily, I was going over 7.5. My average BSL was 7.8 and my HbA1c would have been under 7. This is actually considered excellent control, okay? So if I'd gone to I did go to the diabetic clinic and they were happy with this. They were like, wow, you're doing really well. As a newly diagnosed diabetic, this is fantastic. But you can see at those numbers there, I'm still exposed to those long-term risks of diabetes, of the complications of diabetes, and I'm still having weekly hypoglycemic episodes. So I was on the diabetes roller coaster, okay? And this is what all diabetics face. And I think this question is a question that pretty much every diabetic will come to at some stage. And they'll say, well, hang on, if I've got 15 grams of carbohydrates, 1 unit of insulin, well, what if I just don't eat any carbohydrates? What if I just don't eat them, Well, and then, are carbohydrates essential for humans? Like, do I have to have them? There's a really good study done out of Sweden. It's quite a small study where they took a bunch of type 1 diabetics and they just gave them a training session in a low-carbohydrate diet, and they showed 2% reduction in HbA1c, they halved their insulin dose, they reduced their hypoglycemic attacks by 80%. That was really important to me, as well as all these other benefits. But also reduced their weight and their blood lipid profile improved. So, I read this study and I think, well, this is promising. This looks pretty good. And in fact, if you look at the history of diabetes treatment, we haven't always been on this sort of low-fat, high-carbohydrate regime. In fact, in 1797, it was recommended that you reduce your carbohydrates in your food, and this was followed up by, 1898, Dr. Williamson, Dr. Allen. He had the Allen starvation diet. Patients would actually survive years on this diet without any insulin. They all died, of course, because you need insulin. So I'm not saying you don't need insulin. They did all, but they would live for years. And then, of course, insulin was discovered by Banting and Best. He was an orthopaedic surgeon, by the way, not an endocrinologist. I like to tease my endocrinology colleagues about that. But and then it was really after that this sort of high-fat hypothesis came about that diabetics have high rates of atherosclerosis. So, we think that fat causes atherosclerosis. So, let's get them off the fat. Let's put them on a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, and that's how we've sort of ended up where we are today. But and then, of course, Dr. Bernstein's book, which was incredibly influential to me, he published in 1997. He's a type 1 diabetic himself and an endocrinologist, and he recommended this very low-carbohydrate diet, and I very much followed a lot of the things he said. 1917, cookbook for diabetics. On the left, the foods you should eat: butter, olive oil, creamy cheeses, meat, fish and eggs. On the foods that you're strictly forbidden: sugars, flour, bread, biscuits, rice. This is 1917. 100 years later, and we're telling diabetics the exact opposite. So I read all these books, I did lots of reading, started, researching on the internet, and these websites I found, very influential. how to think about our evolutionary history and how we sort of the diet we used to eat. And, we're a hunter-gatherer society. Agriculture really only commenced 10,000 years ago. And so their diet composed of meat and fish and eggs and green leafy above-ground vegetables, nuts, seasonal fruits. No absolute requirement for carbohydrates, no essential carbohydrates. There is no carbohydrate deficiency disease. There are protein deficiency diseases, there are energy deficiency diseases, marasmus. There is no carbohydrate deficiency disease. This is where we came from. This is what we used to eat. We were healthy and strong. We've had a talk about the science today. We run a hybrid engine. It's the way I like to think about it. Humans run a hybrid engine. We don't have to run on glucose. Everyone thinks that we have to run on carbohydrates and glucose. We run beautifully on fat. It's a great fuel. Our mitochondria is very happy to burn fat, and once you've adapted to running on fat, you will run beautifully on fat. So, December 15 now. I've been on the sort of roller coaster for a couple of months now. I'd read all this thing and I'd educated myself. I decided I was going to change to a low-carb, high-fat diet, and so I reduced my carbohydrates to less than 30 grams. I ceased my bolus insulin and just took my basal insulin. So the basal insulin is the long-acting insulin that I take at night, and the bolus insulin was the insulin that I had to take with every meal. And that's the current regime for most diabetics. They take one dose at night, or sometimes two basal doses, and then they have to dose for each meal, okay? So I switched my diet to these sorts of food: green leafy vegetables, lots of oil, salads, lots of salads, meat and eggs. Well, what happened? Well, firstly, you have to go through the period of keto adaptation. I always warn people about this because they don't understand it. I've got there, that's the fuel switch on a Spitfire, sort of switching from tank to tank, and it's a little bit like that. You've got to switch your body over to a different fuel. And so that takes time for the body to adapt. What actually happens is the mitochondria increase the fatty acid transporters across their membrane. So if you're on a high carbohydrate diet, your mitochondria are very used to shuffling glucose across the membrane, but not very good at shuffling fat across. And so during this adaptation time, you increase the number of fatty acid transporters across your mitochondria so that your mitochondria can take advantage of this fuel that's now in plentiful supply. So I had transient lethargy, I had lightheadedness, I had headaches, muscle cramps, all very common symptoms of keto adaptation, okay? So that's expected. I wasn't worried about it. I knew all about that because I'd done all the reading. And we've heard a little bit about the questions I get asked, whoa, ketones, hey, they're dangerous. We know all about, ketoacidosis, this is crazy talk. And a lot of doctors do not understand the difference between nutritional ketosis and diabetic ketoacidosis, and it's a key point of understanding. So in nutritional ketosis, you have some insulin on board. I do because I inject myself with basal insulin, so I have insulin on board. Ketones typically run at about 0.5 to 3. Now, ketones are slightly acidic, but the body can buffer if they're in small doses, okay? It's when they go higher that the body's buffers get overwhelmed. And the blood sugars are normal. In diabetic ketoacidosis, you've got an absence of insulin, either near or complete. Ketones are 15 to 25, you're acidotic and your blood sugars are high. Non-type 1 diabetics don't go into ketoacidosis because they always have some insulin. But type 1 diabetics, this is a real threat, this is a deadly condition. And you need to remember as well that illness increases insulin requirements. There are some significant advantages to the ketogenic diet. Essentially what you're doing is you're now partitioning your fuel, and this is the way I think about it. So I've now got ketones as well as glucose in my blood supply, so I've got two forms of fuel. The glucose that I've got in my blood fuels my red cells and some of my brain. The ketones fuel my brain and my fatty acids fuel my muscles and organs. So because I'm not drawing on my glucose all the time, because my muscles and organs are using the fatty acids and my brain's predominantly using the ketones, the glucose is far more stable than it was. So if you talk to type 1 diabetics, they're on this roller coaster because their muscles and organs are using the glucose, their brain's using the glucose, that's driving it down all the time, and they're having to keep shoving it up with food, and then they're trying to balance that with insulin. It's a nightmare. So how do you exercise without carbohydrates? Well, again, we come back to the mitochondria that I've got there. Now you can feed fat into the mitochondria, you can see on the right, or you can feed glucose in on the other side. So muscles can use fat or glucose for fuel. In fact, there's some advantages to the fat side because your fuel tank, you see, is 80,000 plus calories with fat, and it's 1,500 calories with glucose. So there's some huge advantages in terms of endurance athletics. So what happened to my athletic performance? Now, I am no athlete, okay? But I have some data at least to show you. So 2009, very slow. This is for a 40-kilometre time trial. And that was the first time I'd ever done it. I was probably riding a bit slow, but 123, 122, and then I had a year off because of the diabetic diagnosis. And then 2013, you can see my time's pretty much identical. So no difference at all in athletic performance. Well, the other thing is, well, didn't you get more hypos, you know? Doesn't your brain need 130 grams of glucose? I was told that by the dietitians. Well, no, that's not true at all. You know, you have to reduce your insulin dose when you do this, and most people reduce by about 50%. But there's actually a reduction in hypoglycemic attacks, and I probably have one a month now. Usually with exercise, I usually know it's coming on, and it's rare and mild. And my brain's got this alternative fuel now. It's got ketones as well, so I'm actually less worried about it. I think this is a neuroprotective diet. Well, what about your lipids? Well, we've heard about this before. Again, you know, the studies show that a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet reduces your triglycerides and your HDL, which very favourably affects your triglyceride-HDL ratio, which is probably the most important cardiovascular risk in terms of your blood lipid profile. And besides that, I just don't understand why this focus on the lipids when we know that the HbA1c is a very potent predictor of cardiovascular risk. That's what you've got to get down. You've got to get it safely down, but you have to get that down to try and reduce patient's risk. And the heart attack risk doubles for every 1% rise in HbA1c above 4.6. Well, and then people say, well, you know, isn't your diet, you know, bland? Well, you know, here's a slide of carbohydrates, and there's this food that I eat on the right, and, you know, it's the carbohydrates that are bland. You know, you have to add stuff to carbohydrates to make them tasty. You know, it's the stuff that I'm eating now which is the full of flavour. Well, you know, so what happened? What happened to my blood sugars? So this is my graph now. This is taken about a week ago, just before this lecture. Insulin dose is now 6 units. This is a year later. Mean glucose is now 5.1. No spikes above 7.5. I probably do once a month. And my HbA1c is now 5.1, which is in the normal range. Here's a comparison. 1 year later. It's on the recommended diet on the left, and the very low carbohydrate diet on the right. And what about your weight? What happened with your weight? You know, this high fat diet. So it's been stable for a year. So 12-month visit to the endocrinologist now. Dose of insulin is now 6 units. HbA1c 5.1, rarely spiking BSL, rarely have hypoglycemic episodes. Triglycerides are down, HDL's up. Blood pressure is 116 on 76, lower than 25 years ago when I was a medical student. Waist circumference is good. Back doing all the normal exercise, mood's good, everything's good. I mean, what can the endocrinologist say? I mean, this is not their advice, but this is the results. And so this message, I think, is, you know, probably the most important message I have today. You know, it takes courage to stand up and speak. And I think that everyone who's speaking today is demonstrating enormous courage, because we're going against the orthodoxy in what we're saying. But it also takes courage to sit down and listen. And that's the message I've got for people who don't believe us. So if you don't believe us, then test it. Go and do the research. Go and read the papers, because it's all there. You're just ignoring it, you know. And just sort of lastly, I know I'm sort of coming to the end. I've gone a bit over time, but you know, the other comment people make is, well, you know, this is just your honeymoon period. Honeymoon period's soon after a diabetic's diagnosed. They've got a few islet cells left, and so they can have a period where they're not too bad. And you know, this is just a single anecdote. You know, what does it mean? Well, and this is a quote from Ron, who's in the audience, and you know, there's a fundamental truth, and that's that blood glucose levels in people with diabetes vary with increasing unpredictability as a consumption of carbohydrate increases. So as you increase your carbohydrate, you have to increase your insulin, and the whole thing becomes very, you know, difficult to manage. It's like if you've got a fire, you know, do you pour petrol on it and water and try and get the balance right? It's ridiculous, quite frankly. And you know, these are some other stories. So I don't know if people know, but I was interviewed on ABC Radio National. You can still find that on the web if you're interested in listening to it, on August 12th. And there are a lot of comments that were put under under my interview, and they're worth reading for people who are interested, because there's 64 comments or so. Here's one from another doctor, type 1 diabetic, eating low carb for 18 months, HbA1c now 4.9, just completed a half Ironman. Another type 2 diabetic, reduced a HbA1c from 7.9 to 5.1, lost 24 kilos of weight, blood lipids normalised. Another diabetic, he's type 1 for 24 years, so he's not honeymooning. He HbA1c 6 to 7, just accepted that he spiked glucose after every meal, thought, well, that's just part of the game, and I would have too. Now his HbA1c is 4.9, and he's a great, he's a successful distance runner, a good distance runner. Here's a young girl, but a mother talking about her 13-year-old son. So, varied and lots of stories. And if you go on the web, there's lots more stories. And I actually credit the web with saving me, because it was those stories which helped me convince me this was the right way. So I think we're on a journey with this. I think it looks a bit bleak at times, trying to convince people that they're wrong. But I think we will succeed. And just as my final slide, I think this is part of where we are. First, they ignore you. I think we're through that. Then they ridicule you. Then they fight you. I think we're sort of partly between ridicule and fighting now, perhaps more fighting, but then we win. Thank you.